That's what I got. Thanks, guys. Yeah, happy to answer questions.
I'm going to just run the mic out to you. I don't know if you can hear it here, but it is being recorded for the stream. So, yeah, let me know.
Thank you, Aaron. This is the second time I've heard this talk, and I even got more stuff out of it. It just sunk in deeper that now I actually really
I'll be back next weekend and do it again for you.
I would totally listen to it a third time. So my question for you is, what do you do as far as management and governance? Do you have anyone going through and like culling or deleting or saying, oh, this piece of information is really outdated, going and renaming tags, doing finds and replaces on tags and notebooks, like anything like that?
No, we don't. We didn't. And
Good.
and it's not necessarily good. So that's the thing about this approach, is like there's so much power and possibility here, but it's not like magic where everything's great now, flowers are popping up. You definitely have to pay attention because the tagging becomes a mess if you don't manage that well. When things get outdated, you do have to kind of pay attention. And it was less about let's have a person own that task and more about let's as we search, there's a date associated with it, and that can give you some context. And so you kind of cull it as you go. So when you find something, you're like, ooh, that's pretty old stuff, not relevant anymore. Just delete it.
So do you have like a 10 commandments or something, like do not delete? Does everybody that's in there, because if you have permissions in there, then people can delete stuff, right? So do you have
Right.
rules of thumb?
We never did have 10 commandments, but I know that larger organizations that are doing this sort of thing, they go to that point. Yeah. We're sort of like historically we've been anti-dogma, and like 10 commandments sounds really negative. So like,
Bad word choice.
yeah, no, but,
Rules of thumb.
right, yeah. Heuristics, right? Yeah.
Hey, Aaron, really good talk, by the way.
Thanks.
We're not going to hear you in the room. That's just for the.
Oh, okay. Okay, so just wanted to kind of talk about the slide where you showed, I guess, one of your colleagues making a UI.
Yeah.
I just kind of wanted to see if you could go back through it and break that down.
Yeah, so all he did was, I'll just rewind here. All he did was he went to Evernote, did a quick search about reports and statistics. And he found a screenshot right here from SurveyMonkey, and we just asked a question in the survey. We happened to have asked the question that he wanted to ask customers. And so we had like tens of thousands of responses to that. So that was a really solid bit of data for him to reference as he was designing. And this is not the UI. This is more like we have this giant printer. He printed this massive poster out there. It's like, hey, everybody, this is what people care about the most. It's like this. So it's almost like a signpost. So that would be a terrible UI.
I thought it was something, I guess, real time that would update throughout, I guess, like kind of like a dashboard type thing.
No, that's the world's worst dashboard. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
Hi. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about climbing that pyramid. In the org where I am, we have lots of data, and the biggest leap is the hurdle to information, and then the analysis part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So not all analysis is created equal, and data is not pure. And I think that's the piece that
Yeah.
sometimes gets tricky. And democratizing the access to the information doesn't necessarily democratize the
Right. You got a more fundamental problem.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's more about how do you get to the analysis? How do you make that happen? How do you democratize the analysis of that
Right.
stuff?
So the question was, for his organization, Going from data to information is the most challenging part. The assertion is that not all analyses are created equal. How do you analyze that in a meaningful way and feel like you've got some certainty there in what you're looking at? And so one thing I'd like to point out in my experience is that there's, especially right now, there's a great romance with big data. It sounds really cool and promising and sexy. If you're old enough, you'll know that this is actually cyclical because it happened in the 80s with manufacturing, that as Japan started to beat us in manufacturing, there was this promise of big data taking over management and giving us these efficiencies. And similar promises happening now in software. But the problem is that the machines just are not as intelligent as humans. They can't. There's a lot of soft decision making that has to happen. So we have a lot of data inputs. Great. We have computers with the capacity to churn through that and find some patterns. Great. That's not really meaningful. That's not knowledge yet. It certainly is not wisdom. And so in my experience, especially in leadership positions, C-level positions, not in MailChimp necessarily, but in the world, people want the certainty of data. They feel like this is truth. That number is truth. Numbers lie as well as a story can lie. And to do that analysis really well, you need to have qualitative and quantitative data. And I'll give you a very specific example in my experience. So the data at MailChimp says Facebook is the most popular integration, and therefore we should spend a whole lot of time working on that integration. The qualitative findings tell us, you've got Facebook connected to MailChimp. What are you doing there? We do it mainly because everyone's got Facebook, and we feel like we're supposed to do that. We don't really post anything to our page or do anything there. But we feel like we're supposed to do that. The people that are actually doing stuff with Facebook and that integration that's meaningful are people running a brick and mortar store where there's some kind of local event thing that's very meaningful. So that's true analysis. That's where I get wisdom about, or at least knowledge, by combining the quantitative and the qualitative. But you've got to have that qualitative present. So thinking like MacGyver, how do we get that in if my organization does not support that? Can you set up a feedback form? Yes, you can do that in a day, and it's very fast. Can I route that into a specific location where I can start to search and find patterns? Yeah, you can do that. You don't have to ask for permissions, probably. You can ask for forgiveness if someone gives you a hard time about it. But there are ways to get these inputs. Do you have 15 minutes in your day to talk to a person on Skype? Yes, you can probably do that. So, there's a lot of like, oh, poor me, I can't do it. Just get it done. Find a way to get the additional inputs you need to give the color you need to the data that you're analyzing. Yeah.
So when you have the search function pulled up and you're looking at all that different data, was there any sort of process put in place to assign importance to it for people who might want to look at it in the future? Anything that would say, okay, these are the things you actually might want to pay attention to highlight the importance of some data so that it's more easily found than stuff that's not as usable to future users?
Not necessarily. I mean, there definitely are some interesting ones. So the question is, when you do a search and you find something that's really salient, something that's really interesting, is that tagged or identified as, this is good stuff? You could tag it, certainly, but we never did. The open feedback form and then the way that we conducted surveys with, we'd have an open question at the end of a survey that would say, is there anything else you want to tell us? It's basically a confession booth where people say weird things. And that sounds kind of silly, but it's where you find what you're describing, the really good stuff. For example, there's a guy in New Zealand named Alex Webster. Don't tweet or say anything. I don't want to embarrass the guy. He's a super genius. And he said some stuff in like a customer feedback form and I think on a survey in that open field that was just like, blew my mind. And so I've talked to that guy multiple times, and he'll like draw diagrams and like, man, he's so sophisticated. He's so technical, and he's got this, business savvy that all kind of rolls into one. I don't need to tag that. I just know Alex Webster is a genius, and he becomes a meme that we talk about him in the office. So.
My question is going to be based on a premise that your ultimate goal to communicate, when you communicate, is the stories. And in those stories, I would assume, that's my premise, that you have context. So when someone is searching, based on the question previously, for information that will bump them up into knowledge and then bump them up into wisdom, is to read the context in those stories. So do you create tags or searchable means to search those stories?
Yeah, so I would categorize everything that's happening in this searchable database as just data and vague information. The whole knowledge and wisdom thing happens outside. Conversational turns into some sort of like, it turns into a UI. That's wisdom right there. There's some other artifact that happens outside of that. Does that make sense to you? Or?
I think the idea that you create stories then allows the person reading it to, through their own internal efforts, reach some levels of wisdom that you aspire to yourself.
Yeah, so in the example of the search, you see different types of data being returned. Like here's a customer interview, here's a survey, here's customer feedback patterns. You look at the various things, which is very, some of it's very qualitative and some of it's very quantitative, but it's a big soup. And I love that it's just a soup that you can look at, and that's where the context happens. I mean, you've got to kind of formulate that in your head of, is this a pattern or a one-time thing? But again, when you do a search for something, you might get 11 pieces of feedback, and you realize, that's one person asking for this thing, a couple people. It's a small subset. It's not a pervasive view based on, all the streams of data that are coming in here. And if that's, if you have some questions about that, like this does seem important, you could get on the phone with them and ask more.
When you open the raw data like this to everyone in the company, do you have any concerns about how maybe people without the proper training can misconstrue this information, misunderstand the data, not analyze it properly, and then kind of bypass the fuller UX process, thinking that, this is the customer feedback, like this is, we can design based on this already?
Yeah, so the question is, when you open up the data to everyone, people who are novices, do they use this, misinterpret it, and then basically, are we undermining our influence as the, owning UX? I would say that that's a very poisonous train of thought when you feel like I've got to hold this to myself, because that is what happens. That's the fiefdom mindset that I described, that it causes you to hold what's valuable close to you, not share, which causes mistrust, which breaks down collaboration and creates those silos. So the opening is saying, it's all here. You can find meaning. It doesn't undermine your expertise because you have a lot of context. Who's talked to more customers than you? Who's read more feedback than you? Who's read through all the surveys but you? You have all of that floating in your head, and you have value still. So you don't have to feel like you're relinquishing your power in your organization. When you empower other people, they're going to feel more confident about what they can do, and they're going to want to come talk to you about this. Chances are they're going to find something that's going to be exciting, and that's probably going to strike up a conversation. I generally trust people. I believe that people are good. And, are they going to misinterpret? Maybe sometimes. I said that you're connecting the data and you're connecting the people. When someone has some aha moment, they're going to talk to someone else. So like there are these built-in checkpoints that can happen where someone can question that assumption that might be happening. So my experience that we haven't had that problem. We've actually found like the QA team just blew me away that they use the Evernote findings all the time to understand customers better, and they build their QA process around customer scenarios. They never would have done that before. That's fascinating to me. So I wouldn't have sought them out and thought, this is relevant to you. So having a little faith in your colleagues, I think, is good.
And on that note, I think we should
Yeah, thanks.